Welcome to Good Marshall's Universal Podcast. I'm Dan Bernardo. This is Keith Mosier, Bo Davis. And we're talking about language. We're talking about things like this. So how important is the language of your style?
Oh man, it's not.
It's not important.
It's not really anymore unless you're trying to read the text and learn from it and you get the terminology.
Okay.
But we've all put it into English because we've all got different books we read from that are very much the same.
Mm-hmm.
It's like this is a right to left falling blow.
Yeah.
Or a fendente, or whatever the hell they call it, or an overhell or something.
I don't know the German.
I don't know German. So if I'm talking to someone who does know German, I won't say fendente. I'll be like, this shit right here. Yeah, I know what that is.
I'm gonna take my sword from here and I'm gonna hit you like that.
Yeah. They know it every time.
Yeah.
No explanation needed, they just know. And I feel like it could be the same with y'all too. You just show a guy a movie, he's like, oh, well, we call it that.
Yeah. I mean, so like sometimes, I think, and I'll let you go. I'll say a little something. When you brought up the reading of the texts, I think when you study a historical or classical or an art that is somewhat connected to a culture, it almost, even if it's just a cursory understanding, I think it's somewhat necessary at the beginning of your training. And then for a while it begins to not be important, and then it becomes very important. And I can talk about that more later, why I feel that. But yeah. What do you think, Steve?
It depends on what you're studying for, as we discussed before. If you're learning to do stuff, it is absolutely not important at all. I agree with the idea that getting to understand the culture from which it comes, your art, your style comes from, it is helpful in that regard. But if you just want to do, that is not necessary.
Yep.
If you're, for most of us, for most of the people listening to this podcast, your art or style is probably from a region where you can't read the language.
Yeah.
And if you can't read it, you're probably also unable to actually speak it. So the nuance of the words is it's not going to just escape you. It's not even there for you to grasp. I get it. To me, I think it's the other way around from what you mentioned at the beginning. Doesn't matter. Even Sifu Fong has said, I don't know. Just do this. Don't worry about what I'm saying. Because through his very thick Cantonese accent, don't worry about what I'm saying. Just do this. Later on, it may become of more value. And later on, you may find methods either of acquiring the ability to read the language, or if not read it, to sift through it and go, okay, this is what they meant. Get somebody to actually translate down deeper. And that has more value perhaps later on. So Guru Asanta tells a story, the world hasn't heard it, I'll tell it. When he was like 4 or 5, he would go to his uncle to study Kali. And being a Filipino born in the United States, and having probably a future idea of being an educator, he wanted to know the name of everything. What is this called? What is that called? And his uncle would say, just do it. Just do it. And one day, his uncle got so pissed off, he said it's Paroy Blanco or something. He just threw out some words. And he was so excited that he went home to his dad and said, I learned whatever. And your dad said, you learned what? You learned the pot is black? And so he then relates that even traditionally in the Philippines, it was pretty much just do this, just do this, just do this. And it was the Europeans that wanted names.
Yeah, they do.
But for them, it was all Kali in the Philippines at the time, for as far back as you want to go. It was just the local clan, the local family, the local group. Hey man, well, what did you do in that fight the other day? Well, I did this. Well, let's practice that. They didn't give it a name. It was just a thing.
Yeah. There's a lot of things I do where I'm like, I don't really have a name for it. might pick up a name, but it doesn't have like a name per se. Like there's a lot of entries into some weird stuff we'll do that lands that you don't normally see in a manual or anything like that. And it's like, yeah, we just started doing that one day. There's no explanation to it, nothing really talked about other than, hey, let's do this. I'm like, that's it. That's all there really needs to be. But you know, you brought up too, there's always one guy who knows the language who will go and translate or dig deeper into what you're studying so everyone else has a better understanding. So I think that for some, the language might not matter as much, but there's always one guy who makes it matter because he goes and he translates, like with fuel ray, there's so many different fuel rays, so many different translations and interpretations. These guys have now built what the guys that are just doing it are doing in a way. All they did was kind of make that framework. Now, well, we've kind of gotten through all of it now, but what can we do past interpreting and trying and just doing? How much is the language going to benefit us at this point because it's just Italian or it's just German? I can see with like Japanese, Chinese, Korean, with the characters, they all mean something and they're all a combination of meanings of something. So that I can see maybe with Eastern cultures it's probably more significant, but I can't notice that with any of the Romance languages because they're already so much like English.
In terms of doing, that's what I'm saying. In terms of just doing, no. Even Musashi, as he was carving his extra long oar into a sword, he might have been thinking, I'm going to do XXX. But when it came down to the fight, his brain was not going word, 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 word. It was whoop, whoop.
Exactly.
And then somebody said, well, what did you do? Anyway. Okay, well, I did this. Okay, so that's a this, and then I did that.
And well, you know, it's funny because in that instance, you know, Musashi knew exactly what he was going to do because his opponent had a special move that he did. And so he went into it knowing exactly what he was going to do. First, he was going to piss him off by being late, incredibly late. It worked. And it worked. And then he knew that, what was his name? Sasaki Kojo, I think that was his name. Did his special flying swallow technique, or whatever it was called. It had a name, you know, and Musashi defeated it with whatever he did. I don't know what he did. But, so I think, when I think of the language, and I am a very big proponent of studying the language. If you don't know that about me yet, you aren't paying attention. I'm a very, very big proponent of studying the language for a few different reasons. The first reason is it binds people together across cultures. So what that means is if I have a student who's training in Tangsudo, for instance, and we do a lot of the class in Korean, they know all the terminology in Korean, and if they ever wanted to go to Korea for some reason and train, they could, and I know people that have, and they go there and they may not understand the language, but they can jump into a class and they can do the class, no issues, none whatsoever. You go to Europe, you go to some place like Denmark, you don't speak their language, but you share a common language, and that is the language of your art, so you can train together. It doesn't matter where you go in the world, and I think that is the first and foremost best reason to study the language of your art. And the second is for teaching purposes. If you're never going to teach, it doesn't matter. If you're, like you said, if you're just learning to do the thing, I don't think it matters. The reason that I say that a cursory understanding of it is good in the beginning is because you don't know whether that person is going to want to start teaching or not. So it's good to give them a little bit of stuff, and then they can either jump onto it if they want to and run with it, or they can not, and they can just run with skill development. That's perfectly fine as well. But when it comes to teaching, it is always good to codify curriculum. It is. If I came into class every day and was like, all right, we're going to do this, there would be a very difficult progression for students, because I would then ask, well, why don't you do this? We did this, like, I don't know, 2 years ago. Why don't you do this? You know? So I think having a codification of curriculum, having a name for things, as long as, and we see this in traditional curriculum, the names are instructional names. They're not necessarily like, what do you call? They are a name that is specifically named so that if I say the name, you will understand the purpose of the movement, the intent behind the movement, what the movement should be doing. So if I were to say to somebody, parry with a finestra and fendente, that is a legitimate instructional piece of information. I'm not telling them, you wouldn't say block with finestra and then cut down with fendente. Like, that's not right. Like, that's very redundant. So, but knowing the language, you wouldn't have to do that. You would just say parry with finestra and fendente. They would know exactly what to do. And that's an easy thing for an instructor to be able to do. And then that person can then transmit that understanding to another person, to another person, to another person. And then we're all sort of together. Now, beyond that, there are meanings behind things, like you said. And sometimes that is helpful, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it is helpful to understand things from a cultural standpoint. Like if I say hadanmaki. Hadanmaki in Korean is a low-level block. Most people say block. Maki, but all maki means is that you're on the receiving end of a technique. So you are receiving a technique. You're defending. That's all it means. It doesn't mean block. It doesn't mean parry. It doesn't mean hold. It doesn't mean, it doesn't give you the exact kind of receiving technique. It just says that you are receiving a technique that is on the lower level, and you're doing this sort of business. Like you can translate that or interpret it in 5 million different ways, but that's not the point. The point is you're telling somebody you're being attacked on a lower level, so deal with it, neutralize it, control it, right? And that's what a hadanmaki is for. But if I were to tell, what ends up happening a lot of times, especially in karate, is they take this word maki, and in Japanese it's uke. And we know that uke means to receive. So over the past, I want to say, like 15 years, everybody's been like, oh, uke doesn't mean to block. Uke means to receive. And so you have to make it turn it into some form of grappling thing because you're receiving the energy. And it's like, you've taken that far too literally, far too far. Yeah. It just means that you're on the receiving end of an attack, right? So it's good to know the cultural meaning, but then sometimes it's not good because then it goes in 5 million different directions.
Uke has also become like a noun.
Uke can be a noun.
Like you are uke if I'm throwing you for demonstration.
Because
right?
you're right, because the person receiving the technique is the uke. And then also, the uke is the teacher in that situation.
But is the uke also hadanmaki?
No.
Okay.
They're two different things, right? Like,
okay.
So hadanmaki is a thing that I do
to receive.
Because I'm receiving a technique.
So what are you?
I am an uke, but I am also doing a geidan uke. They are two different things.
So in Korean, would you be a make?
Yes.
Okay.
But so then that also goes back to like what kind of terminology does your system use? So like my lineage, I would be the yin person. I would be the passive person receiving the technique. But like all of that can that lead to incredible confusion? Yes, it can.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Good Marshals Universal Podcast. We're talking about language. Does language matter to you? If this is something that you're interested in, subscribe. Hit that notification bell, like it, and share it with your friends. And join us next week when we continue talking about language.